Welcome everyone to our IES webinar, Net Zero Skills, Why, When, Who, What and How. Today we are joined by our very own Joseph Lewis, Policy Officer for the Institution of Environmental Sciences. Joseph joined the IES in 2020 and is responsible for delivering policy for the IES and working to promote the use of the environmental sciences in decision making. He has a law degree from Durham University and an MSc in public policy from the University of Bristol, where he specialised in environmental policy. Today's webinar has grown out of a previous presentation Joseph recently gave on net zero skills, priorities for transformative change. This was given as part of the work of the IES to work collaboratively with other organisations to ensure environmental considerations, scientific insights and systems thinking are represented at every level of decision making. This webinar is part of our activities in the fourth theme of our stages on the road to COP26, Green Society. This IES webinar will provide an introduction to the kinds of skills we need to support a transition to net zero carbon emissions, placing the need for skills transition in the context of transformative change, just transition, and lifelong learning. As always, there will be the chance for questions at the end of the presentation, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation. I will then ask these on your behalf later on. Thank you for logging in. I will now hand over to Joseph.
Thank you, Eloise, and thank you all for attending. I'm Joseph, I'm the Policy Officer at the IES, and like we say, we're going to be talking about net zero skills today. So we're going to be beginning by discussing some of the context and the big theoretical ideas which underpin a lot of the ideas around net zero skills. Then we'll move on to place these very broad, very theoretical ideas in the context of net zero skills. And net zero itself is a somewhat imprecise term, which we won't be looking at too much today. But for the purposes of this webinar, basically what we'll be referring to is the transition that we need to make to respond to the climate crisis and what that's going to inevitably look like in terms of skills, regardless of the specific form of that transition. And it's in that context that we'll be asking these big 5 questions. Why do we need a transition to net zero skills? When does it need to happen? Who will be affected by it? What kinds of skills are we talking about? And how can we kickstart the move towards net zero skills? Over the course of that, there are a few case studies and ideas which we'll be bringing in. But hopefully this is a conversation which we can address from a perspective which is quite wide-reaching. So hopping straight on into that. What's the context to all of this? Well, first off, climate change and the upcoming COP26 climate conference, which is currently scheduled for November. By this point, we don't need to be having conversations about what emissions are or why they need to be reduced. Our focus has to be about how we can make that happen and what society needs to do to affect change. And we're seeing actually a renewed push for action in the lead up to that conference, especially in the UK, where the summit's going to be hosted, and in the USA, where President Biden has made transition one of the focuses of his presidency. Then we also have the context of the recovery from COVID-19. There's been a real drive to make it a green recovery and to build back better by making the economy more sustainable and more resilient as we come out of the pandemic. And then also just this month, there's some important movement happening. So ahead of the G7 Global Leaders Summit, which has just finished, there was a letter calling for sector by sector plans for transition and what that would mean in practical terms. And there was also a report by the New Economics Foundation highlighting the power that a just transition might be able to have in addressing climate change and supporting communities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that concept of just transition in a moment. But the important thing to know is that this is definitely an area where we're seeing renewed and regular action. And if we're going to address climate change and reach net zero carbon emissions, we need what we refer to as transformative change. We need to recognize that everything involved here is part of complex systems. So we can't just make small incremental changes. We need to make changes which transform the system as a whole. Hopefully that's a concept which some of you will be familiar with, but if not, don't worry, because I'll give you a brief primer on transformative change in a moment. But the first thing you need to come into this with is a systems approach to thinking. It's something we really try to champion here at the IES because it speaks to the way that we understand relationships as they exist in nature. And as a heavily simplified example here on the screen, say you're trying to address the risk of flooding. It's affected by weather, it's affected by the water system, your rivers and watercourses. It's affected by the state of the land and soil. For example, is there porous soil to buffer against the risk of flooding? And that would just be 3 quick pressures which are going to affect flood risk. But if we want to start thinking about things as systems, we need to go deeper than this. The quality of your watercourses is also affected by the quality of your soil. The state of your weather is going to affect the quality of soil and land. And if you do have floods, then that's going to affect your watercourses and your soil health. So you can quickly see that all of these systems interact with each other in very complex ways. And when we start bringing in much bigger processes like climate change, that affects all of these systems at the same time in different ways. And those effects from climate change exacerbate the ways that some of these systems can contribute to, for example, flood risk in this case. And likewise, the amount of carbon stored in soil can exacerbate or alleviate climate change. So even with these ideas, which we might consider to be universal processes like climate change, you can see that they're still part of these interconnected systems. And then the level beyond climate change is the human element. You have politics, society, and the economy all fueling climate change, all interacting with land, water, and air in different ways, and all very profoundly tied to the results of climate change, flooding, and the state of the environment generally. Every element of the system has the potential to interact with and influence every other element. And these are complex relationships. But ultimately, you should be able to see that this does all come back to skills. What skills we have and what skills we value changes what the economy looks like. So that's immediately changing how the economy influences all these systems. And then the skills we have change how we function as a society. It changes the way we live our lives, where we live, how we get around, how we interact with others, and how we see the world. So it's one of these things where the effects of looking at skills really have a quick and complex effect on how the system as a whole looks. So when we're thinking about skills, we need to give a little thought to the decisions we make, because if we give people the wrong skills, we might be quietly making all of these interactions worse. But if we pick the right skills to support and develop, we can do some really big things that change these end results in a big way. So when we think then about transformative change, there are 2 lessons we can take away immediately from that. Firstly, reducing pressures does not end them if they are still embedded. We need to remove them altogether or decouple these systems from climate pressures. And secondly, addressing one pressure doesn't address them all. We need to address the system as a whole. Most importantly, we need to look at it from the perspective of systems of consumption and production. How do we stop them embedding climate pressures in our society and in our economy? So then in that context, why do skills matter so much? Well, we need to make changes at the smallest scale and carry them across all of these systems, and skills help us to do that. But also, as I said a moment ago, skills shape the big picture. They shape our economy, the way we interact with society, and the way our society interacts with the environment. If the only skills that a community knows, for example, are unsustainable ones, and the only ways that they know how to make their livelihood come at the expense of the environment, you can't both fight climate change and also look after those people. So with that understanding of the ways that skills can have such a profound impact on our environment and our natural world, I'm going to take you quickly through 5 big questions, as I say, about net zero skills. Why, when, who, what, and how. So going straight from that context, why are net zero skills so crucial? Well, first we have this idea of just transition. And the concept is recognizing that where there will be a transition to reduce the risks of climate change, to mitigate and to adapt to climate change, there are going to be significant opportunities for substantial benefits. The goal of a just transition is to ensure that transition is socially and economically just, and that the benefits of economic transition are shared widely. Given those who are currently involved in many of the sectors most in need of transition are often those who are least able to change the ways that they're working, we need to ensure green transitions don't leave people behind. And that's especially important in the context of skills, where those skills not only support the transition, they can help to ensure that it's a fair one as well, and that they can provide big benefits to communities at the same time. And as an aside, if you're interested in this big idea around just transition, it's something which the IES has done quite a bit of work on recently. You can catch another recent IES webinar on our YouTube channel right now, which was looking at the role of nature-based solutions in a just transition. So if you're interested, you should definitely take a look at that. But what's important to know for this conversation is that there's an opportunity here for multiple benefits, social, economic, and environmental, all at the same time, if we do things in the right way. And there are also benefits to the early adoption of net zero skills for countries, sectors, and communities. The first is skills leadership. There are advantages to having skills before the majority of the population, especially for communities which have historically been excluded from opportunities, where young people can really benefit from being part of a community which is getting ahead of the curve on those skills. And then there's also the context, as I said before, of the green recovery from COVID. We want to avoid the need for recovering from a second crisis caused either by climate change itself or by the transition if you have dependency on skills which are no longer sustainable. So you can imagine a scenario where we suddenly need to play catch up with our response to climate change and we no longer have time to develop new skills. In that scenario, there could be a massive economic and social effect of the necessary transition. And so we need to be ready for that transition. If we want to be in that position, we need to create the right skills in the economy ahead of time, which means starting now. And then there are also legal and regulatory changes already taking place, which will mean that skills which aren't sustainable are going to become redundant. So it's about risk as much as it is about opportunity. So it's not getting left behind by climate regulations, for example, in environmental land management, in agriculture. The transition from the EU Common Agricultural Policy to public money for public goods in the UK over the coming decade is going to mean lots more money for those working in agriculture if they're able to shift from the skills they've been using to be productive in terms of their outputs towards providing public goods for which they'll soon be rewarded financially. But working practices aren't just changing in agriculture, they're going to need to change everywhere. So it's relevant across all the sectors and professions which make up the economy, especially where environmental scientists are likely to be working, which we'll pick up on in a moment. But first, if we understand that this is something which needs to happen, when does that process need to begin? And the answer is now. And the earlier we can start, the better. So it's good that lots of the work on this has already begun in different places. It also can't wait because events are already in motion, whether we want them to be or not. The transition is happening, and the faster we can collectively seize the opportunity, the better it'll be for those of us who do. And the good news, as I say, is that lots of what we need is already happening. There are lots of good case studies and plans that we can copy and learn from. It's possible to learn from what they've done and find ways to adapt that to our own context, which can speed things up. And there's also some movement from governments to support these kinds of transitions. There are calls for the UK government, for example, to adopt a low carbon skills strategy. And there are ongoing efforts by communities to ensure that these kinds of transitions are supported. So, for example, the IES recently was quoted on how important this kind of transition is in a report by the UK Parliament's Environmental Audit Committee. But we can't wait for that support to be in place before we start planning, or we're going to be left behind. The good news is that's still very achievable, and it's still very achievable to catch up to the trend and be one of the first movers here. In terms of the scope then, these changes are naturally going to need to be transformative, but which industries are we expecting to see the biggest changes? And that question very much follows from the earlier conversation about systems. The sectors which are currently most responsible for embedding those pressures on the climate are where we're going to need to see the biggest changes in how we do things. And in particular, there are 4 systems that we think are likely to see the biggest change in how things work, which are food and land, not just agriculture, but also tourism, supply chains, groceries, everything that links to how we use land and how we produce food. Energy in terms of renewables and then delivery, but also power systems and how that's all constructed. Transport and mobility, so that's public transport, it's cycling, it's cars, it's the connectivity of cities and how cities are put together and what it means in terms of when we need to travel. So it's the school bus as much as it is the public highway. And then it's the built environment. So it's housing, efficiency of that housing, construction, planning, and the way we build things and put things together. But it's also important to recognize that it's going to affect everything. These systems alone already interact with a much wider area of linked issues through their value chains. So even if you're not working directly in one of these industries, you're going to see changes in the way that you work, and that's going to affect the skills that you need. And that can be illustrated once you start looking at the numbers. In the UK, 1 in 5 workers, which is about 20%, and 6.3 million jobs in total are going to be affected by the transition to a net zero carbon economy. And that's about 3 million or 10% who will require upskilling, and then another 3 million with skills which are going to be in high demand. And then if you look at the jobs which rely on the state of the environment, that's about 1.2 billion jobs globally. That's about 40% of total world employment who depend directly on ecosystems in the natural world. So it's a massive amount of the population who are either affected by this transition or who have some kind of stake in it. And the opportunities are also massive. The transition could create 24 million additional jobs worldwide. So there's also an opportunity here to grab a slice of that development by spreading access to the right skills early on. So hopefully that's given you an idea of the scale of things, but also given an insight into why you should be interested. So what skills are we talking about? Really, there are two categories here: the priority skill areas that we need during and after that transition, and then the skills which already exist in the workforce, which are going to see a big increase in demand. So the skills needed to transition, which is, we're talking about future ready skills broadly here. And that includes digital skills, climate literacy, sustainable understandings, which we're going to need to see across the economy, as well as the very transferable skills, which are useful broadly, but which are especially important for these complex transitions where people from different specialisms need to work together in ways they may not have done previously. And then another of the really crucial elements is helping leaders and managers to be more comfortable with sustainability and net zero, to really embed it as an idea. And those kind of sustainability leadership skills are really important to develop and instill for everyone, regardless of where they are. And this first group of skills, it's an area where the IES is doing a lot of work. And you should hear more soon about our work on green skills during this Green Society stage of our work ahead of COP26. And on the screen here as well, you can see in that second bullet point, an example of the kind of skills we're talking about in the construction industry, which is a little further ahead on this journey than some other places. So you can see that the kind of skills we're discussing there are how to undertake retrofit or conversion, ways to utilize modern techniques, transferring skills to new applications, and individual competencies for future proofing. And that's, I think, generalizable to the skills we need to make specific transitions, ways to manage those new systems sustainably, and then generalized transferable skills, which are designed to fit into a net zero economy in the future. I think those three categories broadly encompass the kind of skills we're talking about. But the good news is that a lot of these skills already exist, and lots of them already exist in the workforce, even if they're not being fully utilized yet. So some examples where demand are going to increase are deep expertise and knowledge. So that's something we're already seeing in the environmental sciences, which is that this is an industry where it's growing and where demand is very, very strong at the moment. And even then, a lot of the roles associated with environmental science are changing in order to meet net zero in ways that will require environmental scientists to have new skills. For example, I know there are lots of IES members who have historically had very technical expertise, who are finding that their roles now involve talking a lot more about the science of sustainability. So they're needing more communication skills, more of those transferable skills, which are so important. So even where expertise already exists, there's a real opportunity for upskilling and transferring skills. And it's likely that this is a big trend, and we'll see this as a trend for the future of the environmental profession, as well as a great opportunity for a whole range of people who can gain these skills at this chance. There's also more to be done in terms of adapting the workforce. Many of those who will be involved in the transition and afterwards in the net zero economy are in the workforce already, but in need of new skills. And there are also people who have those skills already who will be moving to new roles through the transition. Either way, the important note here is that it's not just about entry-level education and skills, it has to be about lifelong learning, because lots of these people are already in the workforce but aren't prepared with the right skills. It's the idea that further education should be linked to every worker and that there should be continuing lifelong learning. And that connection has been lost in some areas over time, but that needs to return if we're going to make the most of the skills we already have and give support to those who will be taking on different roles in the future. And then that learning needs to be specific to net zero and the opportunities coming out of this agenda, because the message is that everyone is a part of this, of using their skills to support transformative change and facilitating a just transition. And this is something that communities do. It's not something which happens to them. So everyone should have access to it. So the final question then is how? How do we make this happen? And the answer is that it needs to come from our community as well as from across the environmental sector and profession. And it also needs to depend on context. But I'm going to very quickly share some ideas very, very quickly and case studies to help you start thinking about what this might look like in practice. So there are a few general ideas to think about how to drive this change. The first is building ambitions and aspirations in our communities. There needs to be a united aspiration to help with the transition and to think about a positive future. And it's really important to be open to knowledge sharing and learning to help find out what's going to fit well in a particular context. And again, there's a key skill to develop here around leadership, helping people feel like they're comfortable being sustainability leaders and letting everyone feel like they own the issue of sustainability and can help to drive it forwards. There's a skill element to that, and lots of people need that skill, but there's also an ethos to it which needs to come from the people driving that change in skills. And then the second is the idea of just transition, which we've already discussed, where the key ideas are involving the community to help them develop aspirations and get them invested in and excited about transition, auditing what skills exist and what skills are going to be needed, and then ensuring that the transition helps the whole community, as well as meeting those mutual goals for the environment, the economy, and society. And we've got a couple of case studies as well, which I'll quickly address. The first is the just transition in Alberta, Canada. So this was a slightly different transition in terms of context. It was a move away from coal and oil towards renewables, where that had been a part of the community for a long time. So they had thousands of workers in coal plants, but national regulations changed, and so they needed to transition. And there are a couple of key things to take away from their experience. The first is the importance of transferable skills. You need to work out what skills you have and how they can be used in the transition. So, for example, in Alberta, they had electrical and engineering skills, which they'd gained in the fossil fuel industry, which were then adapted to be used with renewable energy. The next thing is that it's important to understand how businesses, communities, and workers can help to facilitate the transfer of these skills and knowledge. And then finally, the final lesson from this case study is that people were willing to learn the new skills and to engage, but they needed to know what the jobs were going to be, if it was going to be able to support their family, and how they were going to get there. They were open to the idea because it is a big and exciting opportunity, but they needed that confidence up front to know that there was a plan and that they had what they needed to get there. And so I think those 3 points really speak to the kinds of transitions we'll be seeing as we develop net skills in other contexts. And it's what it might look like in practice. And you can see that once you have a plan in place and once you engage people the right way, you can make it work quite well. And then the second case study here to help with that idea building, these are about skills planning. And these should help you think about the role that each one of you could play in supporting a net zero skills transition, how you can be a part of it and potentially to get something from that transition yourselves. So the first example here is the Scottish Skills Plan. It's a really great and comprehensive plan for how you can look at the role of skills in transition. Some of the highlights are that they're looking at the same 4 sectors that I identified earlier, but also in manufacturing, resources, and waste, where they're trying to embed lots of ideas in the circular economy. And the strategy also really underscores the importance of understanding the future skills which Scotland is going to need and how they've gone about doing that. And then the other element is the same one that we raised before, that professionals in the community should be aware, involved, and invested in transition, because there's a recognition that you need behavioural change to make it happen, but you also want this to be an opportunity which can benefit everyone. And the Scottish Plan makes it very clear that this is about preparing for the future and that everybody is a part of the plan because everybody will be affected by the transition. And then secondly, just a very quick reference to the construction industry skills analysis model, which they've used to assess the construction industry. There's great examples in there of how you can look at the skills in a community or an area or a sector and how they might fit in with the transition. Basically, 3 steps. 1, you work out what scenario you're looking at for a transition to net zero. 2, you work out how many people you need in certain roles, and then you work out what skills and qualifications those people are going to need. So it gives you a model that you can use to plan what needs to happen for a given sector or community quite easily. So how do you take it forward from here? Firstly, you need to set high ambitions for your sector, your community, but also yourselves. Think about all these opportunities for development and growth which you could have and the ways that you'd like your own skills to develop and change over the course of our transition towards net zero. You need to ask what skills and assets already exist where you work and where you live, then make plans for the sectors and jobs which need to transition and make yourself a part of those plans that you can be invested in that growth. Embrace lifelong learning and skill sharing, and then just keep moving forwards. Stick with that high level ambition for a skills transition, because there are big changes coming and it's a big chance to seize that opportunity and be part of something significant. It's something we can all do. And it's not just an opportunity for people working. It's not just an opportunity for people working in every specialism. It's actually a chance to put something really positive back out into our society. So I'm just going to leave you here with some links to some useful documents I've referenced. And as always, we'll share the slides through the usual channels so that you can have a look at these yourselves when it suits you. My email is also on the slide, so feel free to get in touch if you have any further questions or ideas around any of this. We're always really keen to hear from our members on policy issues, and especially on this topic of skills and the future of the profession, where everyone has such a stake in things. But that's it from me from now. So thank you, Eloise.
Thank you, Joseph. That was a really insightful webinar. So we're going to go over to the Q&A now. I'm just going to check if anybody's asked any questions yet. Please do get involved if you've got any queries, but I'll start off with a question, Joseph. When we're talking about these kinds of skills and how we develop them, how useful are things like apprenticeships and further education for giving new skills to people who are already in the workplace but might need those skills once we have transitioned?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's a somewhat complicated and contextual answer. So whilst I think, as I said, I think further education and lifelong learning needs to be a part of how the economy functions as a whole. They can no longer just be seen as a single stream of how young people are educated. They will play some kind of fundamental role in the development of these skills inevitably. Apprenticeships as a specific vehicle are slightly complicated because they do tend to apply to, and they're very much targeted at a very particular class of people. And the way that those people are going to develop early skills to go into specific careers. So they may be useful, particularly for early careers, people developing early skills, but they're not going to be universally useful. And probably we will need some combination of different ideas in the way we approach further education. I think there's actually a lot of very simple things that most workforces can do and that many of us will already be doing. I mean, everybody here is here in, at least in part, for CPD purposes. And it's that kind of thing that is going to help people develop these new skills, particularly a lot of the transferable skills. There are means that people have to access those already. And when it comes to the more specific skills, which are going to be sector by sector in a lot of cases, we need to see the employers themselves and workforces playing some kind of role in helping to develop those skills, I think. But there's not really one answer that fits all in this case. I think it's something where we're going to need to see sort of a varied approach that will change sort of sector by sector.
Okay, great, thank you. I've got another question. There's nothing in the Q&A box at the moment, but please do get involved. So my other question was, what should the role of professional bodies like the IES be in supporting this transition to net zero skills?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's obviously, I suppose, the big question from my side of things. I think it's really, well, I mean, if you look at what we're doing already, we're doing things like this. We're trying to work on pushing that skills agenda and helping it be accessible to people, and trying to have conversations with our members about the ways they can develop skills. And like I said, I can't talk too much about future things we're doing down this road yet, but you should wait to see things the IES is specifically doing. I think the role that professional bodies have is being professional bodies. They represent an entire profession and the people who work within it. So there's a real way to help those people develop the skills that they would want to have. And professional bodies are quite uniquely placed for that opportunity. So I think they definitely need to play quite a large role. And again, it will probably vary sector by sector on what that needs to be.
Questions. So do you think the environmental profession will need to integrate itself into other sectors to push forward the net zero agenda? If so, how can the IES support them in this? Slightly similar to what you were saying, but maybe elaborate. Yeah.
But no, I think it's a really excellent point. And I think it's something we're already seeing is that particularly, and it's slightly different specialism by specialism, but you're seeing a lot of sustainability professionals, for example, moving into there's the line that blurs the boundaries of the environmental profession it's becoming increasingly sort of blurred and imprecise, because if we're going to move to a society that is net zero and part of that an economy which is net zero, then we need environmental considerations to be part of everything that we do. And so inevitably environmental professionals and environmental scientists in particular are going to need to be involved in many, many more areas of the economy than they've been in the past. So I think this attendee is perhaps striking something quite relevant, which is there needs to be more integration, even if it's not the integration of specific roles, there needs to be an integration of ideas a lot more than there is now. And when we go back to those big concepts at the top of the webinar, things like systems thinking and transformative change, those aren't present in the conversations they need to be yet, not universally speaking. I mean, a lot of people are making good progress, as I say, but I think there's a real opportunity for more integration of that kind of thinking, even if not the more detailed sort of professional integration that this person's angling at.
Okay, great. And Catherine Monk has just mentioned, I'd like you to review Joseph's answer about apprentices. I think it raises a number of concerns about perceptions around apprenticeships that causes concern, not perhaps online, but for you to deal with internally.
Yeah, I agree. So I think I'll clarify my comments. I wouldn't want it. I'm a big supporter of apprenticeships in my personal life. I think my problem here is that when we are looking at big scale skill strategies, this has historically been the approach. And I think that is very much the perception that's there. So I think definitely, Catherine, I would agree with you in this instance. I apologize if it came across that I was reflecting the sort of denigrating view of apprenticeships. I definitely wouldn't think that myself. And I know a lot of people who've gained a lot from apprenticeships at every stage in their life. But certainly the branding around apprenticeships and the access that a lot of people have to them is not there at the moment. And so we need a complex array of vehicles to help develop these skills. And like I say, I think apprenticeships needs to be one of those, but it's not going to be universally applicable to all professionals in from my perspective. So I think that's definitely my take on the answer to that. But I think there's lots of innovative things going on with apprenticeships, and I think it'll be very interesting to see how those play out and if they end up being more than they are currently being utilised for.
Great. And somebody else has asked, could you elaborate on your point about the people whose jobs are going to be most impacted by the transition, or are those least able to develop new skills? Are there any further readings about this?
Yeah, so there's historically, there have been lots of barriers to, and I think the Alberta example is a good example of where there have been real barriers to people being able to develop new skills, which is why it's so important to audit the skills that you already have. And a lot of the time it turns out that actually the skills you have are the ones you need for the transition anyway. And so if you look at, for example, this example of Alberta in Canada, and I know there are some good examples. If you look at the screen here, there's a report by IPPR who talk about this case study in a lot more detail. So if you're looking for more reading, that might be quite a useful one, where people had a real self-perception that they lacked the ability to gain new skills. And it develops a fear for a lot of people that they're not going to be able to make it through the transition, which is why, first off, you need to ensure that people have access to time and money needed to develop new skills where those do need to happen, but also that they have an understanding of the skills they already have and the ways that those skills can be relevant.
Great. And we have a question from Adam. Recently, a number of new players have come into the environmental sector, with PwC and other traditional accounting firms taking some of the business in the net zero area that logically should have been done by environmental consultancies. What skills should we be developing to prevent this market penetration by the Big Four?
Yeah, so I suppose this is the flip side to the question about integration, which is that there is going to be an increasingly complicated way in which environmental skills are delivered in the economy. And I wouldn't profess to have an answer to preventing PwC and other Big Four consultancies speaking out on environmental issues and potentially taking up some of that sector. I think that's probably a more complex macroeconomic question than I'm able to answer. But if you have the right skills and if you're saying things which are useful, you're going to be in a position to do the job that you need to be able to do. And so I think environmental consultancies would be well placed to audit their own skills, the skills that exist, and look one stage beyond the future, because this is what firms like the Big Four are doing very well, is that they always look forward to the horizon at what skills they'll need in the future. And particularly as we talk about net zero skills, it's going to be important for environmental consultancies to deal with these ideas head on. So the more they can do to think ahead to how those skills need to develop and self-reflect, the better position they're going to be economically to defend themselves against competition like this as well.
Great. And then from Michael, we have a question. Public sector procurement will have to demonstrate net zero and green procurement policies. As smaller and less experienced companies start to develop these skills, how can they be supported in demonstrating their competence to clients? The adoption of net zero will be more quickly adapted if companies are rewarded for trying. Any comments on this?
Yeah, so I alluded to this earlier to some extent. There needs to be a government element to this. I don't think anybody here would think that this is something which can happen without the involvement of government alone. My key message would be that there are things that we can be doing ahead of time to get ahead of the curve, but inevitably there's a role on public sector procurement in all of this, as always there is in environmental concerns, particularly around the climate. There's a role for businesses to play, and like you say, they need to be incentivized to do the right things. There's not too much that can be done to force the government to do things ahead of it doing them, but the government will follow the economy. So if the economy starts to pursue the right skills, and as we're already seeing, if it starts to value the right skills, that will cause the government and companies to follow. That will happen in time, but we need to start acting now to ensure that net zero skills are available for all people all the time in order to make that transition work.
Definitely agree with you. The time is now, after all. So a question from Jaime: how can the academe help in this transition?
Well, academia is doing a lot already to help with the concepts of just transition. It's, as a concept, it's sort of, I won't go into too much historical stuff on this. It mainly comes from the trade union movement, but there's a lot of academic involvement in the way that concept has developed. And so academia has helped to think around what needs to happen a lot. But I think there's also, and the answer for academia is similar to the one with apprenticeships, where there's a fundamental role that needs to be played, but it can't be a whole solution, because academia is not an option for a lot of people who need to develop new skills who are already in the workforce. So it's another tool in the toolbox in terms of developing skills constructively. The other thing I would say on this is that there are specific things that academia can do around things like climate literacy, about embedding these ideas of sustainability into programs which historically wouldn't have looked at these things, which are changes which are happening already. And in fact, the IES has done some work on this previously, and we've talked about the value of an environmental education in our journal, which looks at some of the academic angles of this. So that might be a particular angle if you're looking at some more reading around that subject.
Great, and a question from Wei: can you please share your views on how to make connections between professional skills with ordinary people's life, i.e. cultivate a low carbon lifestyle?
Yeah, well, that's a very big question, I think, and perhaps one that is, again, slightly outside of my reach. I think it's something that needs to happen over a long period of time. But I do think it's intuitive to a lot of people already that they have this understanding, this emotional connection already to the skills that they have and the way that they live their lives. And so I think there are ways that developing these skills will help people to naturally pursue a low carbon lifestyle. And you talk about climate literacy, you talk about people having understandings of sustainability and systems thinking. Inevitably, that changes the way that you behave and the way that you engage in your day-to-day life. But then there's also ways that it goes the other way, from your everyday life back to skills. And it needs to be iterative and develop, because this isn't a transition that happens and then it's done. We need to live more sustainable lives in general, and our skills need to continue to develop over the course of our lives to reflect that and reflect what our society needs to be. So in terms of the practically making that connection clear for people, it's something which is happening, but I don't have a perfect answer for you, I'm afraid, in terms of how we make that happen right now.
Okay, and I think we'll do one last question. I've seen some professional organisations, such as those for accountants, as we were discussing earlier, providing, for example, carbon auditing courses or certificates. How can environmental professionals stand out when competing with some traditional professionals?
Yeah, so I think this is sort of it's the small scale version of that question we had earlier from Adam about competing with the big four, which is how can you stand out as an environmental professional? I think first off, shamelessly plugging things like this CPD opportunity. It's a great example to give yourself a leg up. because once you have these understandings of sort of basic level stuff, and once you have that diverse pool of CPD opportunities and other ways to grow your own understandings, that snowballs and develops quite quickly. And the ability to talk the talk and walk the walk is going to give you just quite a hard edge against what you I think it was referred to in the question as traditional professionals, but I mean just like those who aren't specifically within the environmental sort of sphere of the profession. And you'll see these qualifications coming elsewhere, like I think you mentioned carbon auditing certificates. Obviously, there are specific courses they're going to be able to take that will overlap somewhat. However, there is still a specific value, as I talked about earlier, in terms of deep expertise of the environmental profession, where we're seeing a growth and an increasing interest in that skill set specifically. So my caveat would be, I think perhaps to not worry too much, keep doing what you're doing, grow those skills, because the core environmental scientist skill set is very much in increasing demand at the moment, and we can see a real opportunity for the future of the profession to be one which is extremely in demand if these skills start to develop more and get recognised a bit more.
Thank you so much, Joseph. So that's all we've got time for at the moment. Thank you again to Joseph for presenting. It was very informative and yeah, really great presentation. So thank you to your attendees and thank you for logging in. I hope you found that beneficial and informative. Don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar in the IES CPD tool. You can do this by logging into the members area. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the IES website and YouTube channel. If you are watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel, like the video and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content. Thank you again to Joseph and all attendees. Thank you for watching.